In today's video, we are going to France around and find out. On February 26th, while discussing the war in Ukraine, French President Emmanuel Macron told reporters that there's no consensus today to send in an official endorsed manner troops on the ground, but in terms of dynamics, nothing can be ruled out. The comments have stayed in the news cycle because, well, that is something the world has been collectively trying to avoid for the last 80 years. That concern may have led to France's defense minister walking back the nothing can be ruled out idea. Now, which of these is more accurate is a mystery to us all. For the moment, though, let's go with the nothing can be ruled out version. And with that, in the shadow of a showdown for the ages between France and Russia, today we are going to discuss France's underlying security concerns that are always operating in the background. The complex story arc that France has undergone from the beginning of the 2014 conflict in Ukraine all the way through to the present. The plausibility of a French intervention in Ukraine. What France's strategy in Ukraine might look like, focusing specifically on a tripwire force and a more direct intervention. And then we will conclude with everyone's favorite game show. Does it trigger NATO's Article 5 provision? But we begin with France's broader strategic positioning. To get in the right mindset, we have to go all the way back to World War II. Quick timeline. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. For the next 8 months, the party sat around and did nothing beyond the French invasion of the Saarland. Hence the name Phony War for the period. On May 10th, 1940, Germany began its western push, with the intention to capture France. On May 26th, the evacuation of Dunkirk began. On June 17th, French General Charles de Gaulle fled to London. And on June 24th, France officially surrendered. What happened next would reverberate through French politics, even still today. De Gaulle then spent the next 4 years trying to build and maintain a coherent Free France, both as a military and as a political entity, with plenty of prodding to the Allies to expel Germany from Western Europe. In the meantime, those still living in France were not exactly having a pleasant experience, and outsiders were wandering around taking photos like this one. Back to the timeline. It was not until June 6, 1944 before the Allies made real progress there, with the D-Day landings in Normandy, a place that we will hear about again later. Regardless, the liberation of Paris had to further wait until August 25th. As de Gaulle transitioned from general to statesman, it was that 4-year gap that colored much of French political military thinking afterward. The main Western powers will still assist France in times of emergency, but do not expect a rush to protect continental Europe. As politics shifted from World War to Cold War, France's concerns altered Western dynamics in 2 ways. First, in 1960, France became the 4th member of the nuclear club. Yes, the United States and the United Kingdom already had the bomb, and as a part of the broader NATO alliance, were obligated to defend France from the nuclear-powered Soviet Union. However, the concern in Paris was that the Soviet army would storm right through Central Europe and occupy France in the blink of an eye. And, yeah, maybe NATO would invoke Article 5's collective defense provision, and eventually mount a response. Keyword eventually. But that would mean little to the millions of French citizens that perished in the meantime. A nuclear France, on the other hand, would deny the Kremlin that opportunity, and put Paris' safety in the bag. The second, and less explosive consequence, was France withdrawing from NATO's unified command in 1966. Notably, France remained a part of NATO the entire time. It was just that French units operated independently and were no longer under the command of NATO's integrated structure. Although France did re-enter the fold in 2009, slow response times linger on the French strategist's mind even today. With that, we can now jump to what France's strategy has looked like thus far in the war between Russia and Ukraine. In fact, France has taken a more active role than it might appear to someone joining the story in 2022. Flashback to 2014. The Maidan had finished. Russia had annexed Crimea, and some little green men had entered the Donbass. No, you silly AI, not those little green men, these little green men. The unflagged Russian soldiers that volunteered their services to nascent separatist movements in Ukraine's east. In the shadow of all of that, leaders from Germany, Ukraine, and Russia met in Normandy to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landings, with the allegiances having evolved just a little bit from before. The war in Donbass came up during the ceremonies, and thus began the Normandy format, which was a recurring mediation process that involved those four countries. If you watch this channel enough, you have seen plenty of photos and videos from the Normandy format. It turns out that the number of times that Zelensky and Putin have been in the same room together is quite few, and it is doubtful that we will ever see anything like this again. Heading into 2022, we now know in retrospect that the Normandy format did not create a durable solution. As Russian troops amassed along the border with Ukraine, Macron was flying to Moscow in search of a diplomatic solution, and giving us this classic image of just how far apart the two sides were, literally and metaphorically. On February 20th, the two presidents talked again, this time via phone. By the end of it, France's leader was convinced that the Kremlin still sought a peaceful solution. In reality, Putin ended the call early so he could get out to the hockey rink. 4 days later, Russian troops were on their way to Kyiv. In an era when European states were under increased scrutiny regarding their military expenditures, France was more or less pulling its weight, burning 1.94% of its GDP on arms and such. It was not quite the 2% that NATO had issued as a guideline, and that Trump had harped on in the preceding years, but it was more than most in NATO were doing at the time. French assistance to Ukraine went further, though. Paris's combined allocations through the first 2 years of the war, both bilateral and through the European Union, totaled $19.32 billion. To put that in context, France ranks third below the United States' $75.40 billion and Germany's $44.98 billion, but above the United Kingdom's $17.18 billion. Nevertheless, February's comments represented a major jump in rhetoric, even if what exactly Macron was trying to do with the remarks is not obvious. Someone from my side of the tracks feels obligated to point out that, in love and war, talk is cheap. If the Kremlin just accepted French intervention threats as fact, then Russian troops would take a more cautious approach, and in turn, Western officials from all over would have incentive to make those kinds of threats, regardless of their sincerity. So the comments may be good at making headlines, but perhaps not much else. I am not even convinced that the message was aimed at Russia. Rather, maybe it was just a call to action for allies. We are crazy and we might just do this, so increase aid now before we have to go through with it. Okay, let's put all of this together and talk about what a plausible intervention might look like. The way I'm going to treat this is to Rip Van Winkle it. Pretend I fall asleep, wake up, and discover that the year is 2025. You tell me that France has militarily intervened in Ukraine, and it is up to me to guess how it happened. The reason for this is because it goes against first principles of how to handle a situation, and sounds a lot more like a major gamble. Let's think about a controlled environment for a moment. Well, let's think of as controlled of an environment as a war can be, where Russia is not just sprinting across the Ukrainian landscape. Under such conditions, it would make more sense for France to exponentially increase aid to Ukraine instead. As such, another way to think of the question is what can a direct intervention do that aid cannot? As hinted at a second ago, the first step here would likely be some sort of breakthrough of Ukrainian lines if there is going to be a major intervention, essentially opening up a scenario where Russia can blitz through central and western Ukraine. This itself would seem to imply that the consensus on Russian casualties in places like Avdiivka are way overshooting. Otherwise, Russia would appear to not have the manpower to execute such an operation. At that point, we would start triggering French concerns about some sort of wider breakthrough on the European continent that recalls those World War II fears. So, like I was saying, not something that I would bet on. Though, to be fair, it may be less about actually expecting Russia to continue, and more about the types of policy concessions and long-term military investments that France might have to learn to live with while being coerced by that nightmare scenario. So, if that is happening, I can see two solutions to the problem. The first is to deploy a tripwire force. This is the strategy made famous in Berlin during the Cold War. Basically, the United States plopped a bunch of troops into the western half of the city. By design, they were not strong enough to adequately defend it. The city was literally surrounded by red, but rather there were just enough of them that there would be an ugly number of American casualties in the event that the Soviet tanks invaded. The purpose of this was to cause enough anger at home that there would be no doubt that the United States would mount a large retaliation. Anticipating that retaliation, the Soviet Union would not try invading West Berlin. Hence, the small contingent of soldiers is called a tripwire, because they set off a greater calamity. Tripwires have already been a part of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Immediately following Russia's initial actions in 2014, the United States initiated Operation Atlantic Resolve, which rotated a small contingent of troops into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence program institutionalized this strategy and expanded its presence to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Finally, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the United States deployed 3,000 additional troops, split between Poland and Romania. In none of these cases were the troops sufficient to make a material difference in defeating a Russian invasion force. Rather, the intent was to give the Kremlin second thoughts about trying. One strategy France could pursue is the next step in tripwire deployments, by moving troops into Ukraine itself. Basically, Paris would have to choose a specific red line. Kyiv would be an obvious choice, but there is a ton of space between it and the current front lines. Beyond that, Odessa would be a more ambitious location, closer to where the front lines currently are. The city itself is the third largest in Ukraine, making it a valuable location to protect. It is also the best place to defend against Russia linking up with Transnistria and causing spillover problems in Moldova. In any case, the specific location would have to be context-dependent, and factor in how much risk France wants to assume by putting soldiers progressively closer to the front. It would also depend on how many troops France wants to deploy. A tripwire line that hugs, say, where Russian law has declared part of the Federation would require tens of thousands of troops. In contrast, the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence deployments ranged between 1,000 and 11,000 troops. Regardless, the idea would not be to undertake active combat operations like Ukrainians do. Instead, they would be used in support roles, like digging trenches, that could then free up more Ukrainian soldiers for the actual frontline work. But, for the most part, France would just pick a spot and wait. Your move, Russia. Because foreign tripwires can do something that mere arms donations cannot do, that is, create credibility, it is plausible that France could adopt such a strategy, even in the absence of a Russian breakthrough, especially if France is deploying somewhere conservative, like Kyiv. For its part, this seems to be the pathway that Russia thinks that France is pursuing. After all, 2,000 soldiers cannot do much beyond serving as a tripwire. Russia's immediate reaction was to threaten to use force against them, but this plays right into the perverse logic of a tripwire. Russia wants to have free reign in Ukraine. A French tripwire would stop that. Once established, Russia would not want to go past the limit. However, France also views active combat between the two as a very bad outcome. As such, if France believed that Russia would follow through on the threat, then negotiating some sort of conciliatory alternative sounds like a better approach. But the trick here is that Russia has no incentive to follow through when push comes to shove. Again, talk is cheap. Thus, France would be better off ignoring the threat and deploying anyway. The stronger play for France would be a more active intervention. Rather than sitting around and waiting, French troops would coordinate with Ukrainian command to either assist in defending against Russian attacks, or, more boldly, engaging in active offensive movements to push back the front line. This comes with two distinct drawbacks as compared to the tripwire option. First, it guarantees French casualties, which French soldiers might not be too excited about. Second, it guarantees Russian casualties at the hands of French soldiers, and with that, all sorts of additional escalation concerns that we will get to in a second. For those reasons, we would only expect to see such an intervention in the case of a major disaster for Ukraine, something like massive daily Russian advances and a delayed response from France that makes the otherwise more desirable tripwire option infeasible, combined with intelligence that Russia is planning to steamroll right through Ukraine's borders and deeper into Europe. At that point, France might not be alone in its intervention. And that takes us to our favorite game show. Does that trigger Article 5? AKA, who doesn't want to be a negative trillionaire? The main point here is that soldiers from a NATO country are going to be shot at, which raises the question of whether these actions could trigger NATO's collective defense provision, which would in turn spiral things into a broader war between NATO and Russia, and that puts the entire world in jeopardy. Uh-oh, did I say the word? If we start with the simplest case, where Russia just straight up attacks Paris tomorrow, we pretty much know what will happen in broad strokes. Deterring that kind of behavior is the whole reason that NATO was created. The extent of the response might be a matter of further debate, but something would happen. Okay, that is one extreme possibility. On the opposite extreme, we have France straight up attacking Moscow, or even Russian troops deployed in Ukraine, which results in French casualties. This is a clear non-invocation of mutual defense, because France is on the offense, even if the intent of the offense is the defense of Ukraine. How's that for a logic pretzel? Hope you are still with me. Anyway, Ukraine is not in NATO, and injecting France into the mix is one too many steps removed. In between those two extremes, though, is where we start getting shades of gray. Let's go back to the Tripwire case, where French troops are minding their own business, and then suddenly a Russian assault leaves a few hundred of them dead. Now what? Technically, this would not be an attack on a NATO country, but rather an attack on a NATO member's troops stationed in a non-member country. That distinction matters if we go into the text of the North Atlantic Treaty. Article 5 says that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe shall be considered an attack against them all. And then Article 6 helpfully clarifies that we are talking about on the territory of any of the parties in Europe. Ukraine is not a party, and so the article does not apply. However, it is worth noting that when Greece's prime minister found himself less than a kilometer away from an exploding Russian bomb while touring Ukraine with Zelensky, there was still plenty of discussion about whether his death would have triggered Article 5. And, as a friendly reminder, this is international relations, where countries can do whatever they want, subject to armed consequences. There is nothing that stops them from interpreting the full text of Article 6 as missing other contingencies and intervening anyway. Okay, that is one end of the gray area. On the opposite end of the gray area, suppose that France was gearing up toward a deployment when Russia preemptively attacked French assets in France. Purely going off of the words in Article 5, this would trigger the Mutual Defense Clause. However, let's take a closer look at the text. The "you do what you think is necessary" and "let's meet and decide how to proceed" provisions in it were a conscious choice by the original signatories of NATO all those years ago. If NATO members recognize the chain of events that led to the Russian attack and are not enthusiastic about it, and further do not want to incentivize emboldenment elsewhere, they could opt to provide some material assistance and leave it at that. Or if you're hungry, just do nothing. Hence, we could expect some level of NATO aid here, but whether it would be treated like a generic Russian attack is unclear. It depends on how the individuals within NATO feel about the situation overall, though this is still something that Russia probably does not want to roll the dice on, particularly in a world where the West is already annoyed with Russia about the invasion of Ukraine. Now for the most nebulous case. Suppose that France is in the middle of an intervention in Ukraine, and Russia bombs French soil, perhaps targeting a training facility or something else directly related to the operation. That definitely clears Article 6's provision regarding an attack on a NATO member's soil. But is a response collective self-defense? In this hypothetical, France was fighting Russian troops in Ukraine, and was not bringing the fight into Russia, whereas Russia brought the fight to French soil. Now, if you ask AI, this issue is black and white. But large language models are only good at parroting text, and do not really think about the question that is being asked. Despite pleas to the contrary, I am not an AI, and I am here to tell you that I don't know. Indeed, the truth is that no one knows the answer to this question, and that is partially by design. All alliances struggle with the emboldenment problem, and one solution is to intentionally not define exactly what triggers a given agreement's provisions. Certainly no one in 1949 was thinking about a NATO country helping Ukrainians fight Russians. To try to map out all of the alliance's possible contingencies ahead of time would just be impossible. So the founding document just gives the broad strokes and lets everyone figure out the details as they go. This also comes with a nice bonus. It allows for the partners to gracefully bow out of assisting for these types of contingencies, without raising questions about the main point of the treaty, that if Russia just straight up attacks, then other NATO members will provide aid. This is the type of thing that France would discuss with its partners before actually entering into Ukraine, and you can see the broad reactions already playing out in the media. Germany wants to pour cold water on the idea, while Poland is expressing warmer thoughts. Though it would be nice to know how everything will play out in advance, that is just how the world of shifting lines works. And as a final thought here, it is worth noting that Article 4 has a separate provision that calls for consultation whenever a member feels threatened, and certainly Russian retaliation in France would qualify as such. Again, with current Western antipathy toward Russia high right now, NATO would likely do something in response. Just don't expect things to immediately jump to nukes. You know, we talked a ton about articles today, so if you are still listening to me, then you must really like articles. Of course, books are really just articles that are combined together. Fun fact, I have a couple of those about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.